In various traditions and beliefs, funerals represent a crucial portal for souls to transition into the afterlife. However, these ceremonies do not always manage to free spirits from their connection to this world. Some souls remain trapped, clinging to unknown reasons, leading to unsettling and often inexplicable events. This is one of those stories. If you have the courage, come with me. Let's begin. Many years ago, I made an irrevocable decision: never to attend another funeral. That decision stemmed from an event that left an indelible scar in my memory. It was during the final farewell to my Aunt Angelica. She was not just any relative, she was my second mother, my confidant, and according to her words, I was her favorite niece. I grew up under her loving care, and her departure left an irreplaceable void. The wake was held at her own house, a wish she had expressed in her lifetime. It was an imposing house, with 2 floors. The ground floor housed the living room and dining room, while upstairs were the bedrooms, hers and her daughter's, my cousin, placed side by side. That night, around 10 o'clock, the atmosphere became heavy. I was exhausted. I'd spent hours attending to visitors, offering coffee and comfort. Despite the fatigue, something in the air prevented me from fully relaxing. It was then that the strange events began. First, the creaking of the stairs echoed in the silence. No one seemed to notice, but I felt a chill run down my spine. I looked up towards the darkness of the second floor, but there was nothing. However, a heavy feeling began to invade the space. I told myself it was just the exhaustion playing tricks on my mind, but soon it would become clear that it was not. Still exhausted, I asked my cousin for permission to rest in her room for a while. The fatigue was overwhelming, and soon the weight of my eyelids won me over. However, before I fell into a deep sleep, a disturbing sound jolted me awake: the crying of a woman. This crying was not normal. It was deep, filled with unbearable pain. I realized it was coming from my aunt's room. I sat up, trying to process what I was hearing. At first, I thought it might be my cousin crying quietly, but something didn't add up. The voice sounded too much like my deceased aunt's. I shook my head, dismissing the absurd thought, and got up to investigate. I walked down the dark hallway, the echo of my footsteps breaking the silence. When I reached the door, I tried to open it, but it was locked. "Cousin?" I called out with a trembling voice. "Are you okay? Please, let me in." Suddenly, the crying stopped. But before I could feel relief, I heard something terrifying, loud banging, as if something heavy was being thrown against the walls or the floor. This noise was followed by even more anguished, heartbreaking screams. Panic seized my mind. "She's hurting herself," I screamed as I pounded on the door, trying to open it with all my strength. The sounds continued, echoing throughout the house like a cry of desperation. Minutes later, my uncle arrived, alarmed. He had heard the banging and tried to break down the door. Soon other relatives arrived, and among them was my cousin, pale and frightened. I froze. How could she be here if I thought she was in the room? My cousin, confused, approached the door and turned the handle. To our surprise, the door opened easily, revealing an empty room. We stood still, dumbfounded. We searched every corner, under the bed, inside the closet, anywhere someone could hide. Nothing. The space was too small to leave any doubt. But though the room was empty, the air felt heavy, as if something invisible was still there, watching us. That event left us completely bewildered. We came to the conclusion that perhaps my aunt had returned to say goodbye to her room, to her memories, to what had once been her most intimate space. However, the atmosphere still felt heavy, as if something else was about to happen. I decided not to try to sleep again. The fear of being alone on the upper floor was overwhelming, so I went downstairs to the wake with everyone else. We gathered around the coffin, praying the rosary. On the surface, everything seemed calm, But that feeling that something or someone invisible was with us lingered, like a whisper in the back of the mind. When we reached the moment of silence and closed our eyes, a disturbing sound broke the stillness, the muffled crying of a woman. I opened my eyes wide and looked around. I wasn't the only one. We all heard it. For a moment we thought someone among us had started crying. But as we looked around, it became clear that it wasn't any of us. The silence grew heavier. No one dared to speak. Then the wailing came again, this time clearer, and we heard it distinctly. The sound was coming from the coffin. A chill ran down my body. Someone whispered in a trembling voice, "Is she alive?" Panic took over. We approached the coffin, and with trembling hands we opened it. As we lifted the lid, we leaned over my aunt's body. "Aunt, speak to us," someone cried, their voice breaking. But she was still there, motionless, her skin cold and stiff, her face pale and expressionless. There was no trace of tears or movement. Nothing. Despite this, we had all heard that lament from inside the casket. It was undeniable, and what disturbed us most was that there was no logical explanation. Fear gripped me. I decided never to attend another wake again. That experience marked me forever. I sincerely hope none of you ever have to experience something like this. The paranormal may seem fascinating from a distance, but when it happens to you, it leaves deep scars. My friend had partially told me that the deceased person was his grandmother, someone I had never had the pleasure of meeting. I didn't want the first time I saw her to be under such circumstances, so I chose to stay out in the living room. The atmosphere in the place was suffocating, almost oppressive. The dim light was barely broken by the flickering candles near the coffin, casting long, dancing shadows. The scattered flowers around barely softened the harshness of the moment. When I sat down, my friend, attempting to ease the mood, offered me coffee and bread. Time passed slowly. Around 2:40 a.m., my friend asked me for a favor, to take the guard position by the coffin. Without hesitation, I agreed. I positioned myself at the foot of the casket, avoiding looking directly at it. With my back turned to the coffin, I stood still, the cold of the early morning biting into my bones. Then, something happened that I would never forget. Around 3 a.m., I saw an elderly woman walk through the door of the room. She didn't walk like the others. She simply appeared. She was an elegant lady, dressed in a sober but distinguished black dress. Her hair was perfectly styled, and despite the sadness she emanated, it was clear she had paid attention to every detail of her appearance. However, something in her demeanor disturbed me deeply. Her eyes were red, not just from crying, but as if they emanated an unfathomable, almost inhuman sorrow. She didn't say anything. She simply walked to the back of the room, sat in one of the chairs, and buried her face in her arms, sobbing. The crying was heart-wrenching, but contained, as if she was struggling not to break down completely. I watched her for about 30 minutes. During that time, the room began to empty. Most people decided to leave, leaving only a handful of us behind. But that woman remained still, crying incessantly. A knot formed in my stomach as I watched her. Her sorrow was so deep, it seemed to tear at the air. When my shift was over, my friend took my place as the guard. I slowly withdrew, but I couldn't stop thinking about that elderly woman. Something about her didn't fit. Her presence felt different, too heavy, as if she didn't fully belong to this world. Here is the continuation of the story, recreated and connected with the previous events. I was deeply worried about the woman who was crying silently at the back of the room. There was something in her pain that made me want to approach her. Finally, I gathered the courage and walked up to her. As I stood in front of the elderly woman, I gently asked if she wanted me to bring her anything, coffee, water, anything that could help. She didn't respond. Her sobbing continued, muffled but constant, as if words were not enough to express her grief. I decided to sit beside her, trying to offer some comfort. I placed my hand on her shoulder, hoping to convey support. At that moment, she slightly lifted her face and with a trembling voice, broken by suffering, said something that froze me. "It's not my time yet. I know I'm not young, but it's not my time yet. I want to stay here with you." Her words were as perplexing as her tone of infinite sadness. I swallowed hard and clumsily tried to say something comforting. However, my efforts were in vain. The elderly woman simply lowered her head again and continued crying, ignoring my attempts to cheer her up. I decided that it was best to give her space. I stood up and walked to the kitchen, where I took some coffee and bread, hoping time would help calm her. About 20 or 30 minutes later, I returned to the room. To my surprise, the elderly woman was no longer there. Her empty chair felt like an echo of her sorrow. I didn't think much of it. I assumed she had quietly left, like people often do when they want to avoid more pain. However, around 6 a.m., something happened that would change my perception of the night. The family brought in a large framed photograph of the deceased woman. It was a portrait they placed near the coffin, and when I looked at it, my blood ran cold. The woman in the photo was identical to the elderly woman who had been crying in the room. Maybe she had a twin, I thought, trying to find a logical explanation. I couldn't hold back my curiosity and asked my friend about it. His response left me speechless. "No, my grandmother didn't have any twins," he replied, looking at me with a puzzled expression. When I explained what I had seen and described the woman, my friend fell silent for a moment. His face transformed, and with a mix of astonishment and fear, he led me to the coffin. "That's how my grandmother is dressed." I was breathless when I saw the woman inside the casket. Her hair, her dress, her makeup, everything matched the elderly woman I had spoken to moments earlier. It was then that I understood her words. "It's not my time yet." She was referring to herself, and her sorrow wasn't for someone else, but because she wasn't ready to leave. That night changed me forever. How could I ever look at death the same way after that experience?